Unique ideas are a tough sell in today's AAA gaming industry. While pushing gaming forward and trying new things was once a main focus, it's now mostly relegated to the indie scene. As development price tags have ballooned, publishers have turned to samey trends and worse, cynically monetize their games to the detriment of the consumer. Back when games could just be games instead of money-making platforms, there was more room for experimentation, which brings us to Mirror's Edge. Developed by the Swedish studio DICE in 2008 and 2016, this short-lived series stands out from their long line of first-person shooters. It's not very often a big studio gets the chance to take such a massive diversion from their regular titles, but it's also what makes the two games stand out to this day. When creating the original title, DICE said they wanted to do something different, broadening their output in the process. After going over 10 different pitches, they finally settled on Mirror's Edge. A guiding focus was, according to then CEO Patrick Soderlund, at the time I remember looking at a lot of games, and they all kind of looked the same. He says, I challenged the team in art direction. Whenever someone looked at a screenshot of this game, I wanted them to understand immediately what game it was. From the moment it was first revealed in 2007, the game started to make an impression. A first-person parkour game had never been attempted before, and it was harkening back to an older style of platforming games, most notably the original Prince of Persia, while also tapping into the urban legend of freerunning. In addition, it was also the opposite approach to the developer's biggest franchise. While picking up firearms was possible, the game would make a point of discouraging it. Released in November 2008, Mirror's Edge would face some stiff competition from the likes of Resistance 2, Gears of War 2, Call of Duty World at War, World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King, and Left 4 Dead, to name a few. Counting on its unique idea and style to carry through, Mirror's Edge would achieve moderate success. Of course, the first thing that stood out about the final product was its overall look and feel. In contrast to many of the grimy and gritty shooters of the time, Mirror's Edge is bright and vibrant. The city of glass glistens in the sunlight, and a cool blue sky hangs over many of the daytime levels. Even over a decade later, the title can look breathtaking. Yet this aesthetic stands as a contrast to the story at play. This is a city filled with underlying corruption and a subtle oppression of the populace. In this landscape, you're not an anarchist trying to bring down the government or a soldier for hire brought on to create chaos. Instead, you play Faith Connors, a rebellious runner simply looking to get by in a world very eager to stamp out those who don't conform. The protagonist's perspective in this setting highlights a kind of free-spirited nature, and this is enhanced by the delicate, understated music score. Composed by Swedish artist Magnus Bergerson, better known as Solar Fields, the soundtrack is serene, almost dreamlike, representing the runner's freedom from the system. While Mirror's Edge resonates thematically, it doesn't translate its greater tone into a compelling story. With the possible exception of Battlefield Bad Company 2, DICE's storytelling skills are very weak, with titles like Battlefield 3 and Star Wars Battlefront 2 boasting some very contrived and poorly produced stories. Written by Rhianna Pratchett, Mirror's Edge is mediocre at best, with a substandard story involving the murder of a politician and the efforts to eliminate the runners throughout the city. It had potential to build a story of intrigue and deception, an investigation that takes our heroine in many winding directions. The game's shorter length doesn't do it many favours. We could have had more time to develop Faith and her sister, understand their bond and give the protagonist more motivation to chase down those responsible for her siblings' imprisonment. The cel-shaded cutscenes that bookend each chapter do fit the game's tone well enough, but they don't have much to say about the characters or provide many inventive twists to the narrative. Still, it wasn't the story that made the biggest impression, but the gameplay. Based heavily on movement, Mirror's Edge's gameplay is all about flow. Player expression has its moments, with Faith being able to navigate different paths while chaining moves together to keep up the momentum. When you're running along, stringing together hand-to-hand combat moves and escaping the authorities, it's an exhilarating ride. The speed and pacing of gameplay is the core of Mirror's Edge, something that has always set it apart. What pulls the game from greatness is the amount of times it slows the player down, pushing the player into combat, making them wait inside lifts for load times, slowly interacting with the environment to solve light puzzles. All of it takes away from the game's main strengths. Part of these breaks in flow is down to hardware at the time, others feel like gameplay oversights. For players who wanted to avoid combat entirely, for example, DICE could have made a crowd surf mechanic where Faith hops off enemy shoulders to reach higher ground. At other points, the game could have worked environmental interactions into running flow. When turning valves, Faith could carry her momentum into the action, flipping over it and continuing her run. By smoothing out these moments in gameplay, the backbone of the title could have been sustained for longer. The game's load screens speak to some missed opportunities, rapid takedowns that could have been incorporated to improve the core gameplay. In a sea of hardcore, high-budget action titles, the original Mirror's Edge stood out and obtained a notable cult following in the process, particularly among the speedrunning community, who have pulled off some insane tricks to break the game's systems. The game would go on to sell 2 million units, a reasonable figure for the time, but the overall reaction was all over the place. Some players loved the aesthetic and the distance it made from all the gritty shooters of the time. Others felt the gameplay systems were weak and lacked polish, which stems from the game's heavy focus on trial and error. This method of play is very stop and start by nature, and creates its replay value by having players gradually improve their skills until they can blaze through levels perfectly. It's a trait most commonly found in the classic Sonic the Hedgehog titles from Sega. Despite not perfecting this formula, the IP still managed to generate a fanbase, something DICE would eventually return to in 5 years' time. Mirror's Edge Catalyst was announced at E3 2013. Electronic Arts rarely holds massive surprises at their press events, so it certainly stood out among all the other announcements. Fans were really excited at the news, and development began to take shape once Battlefield 4 wrapped up. But EA had no intention of making it a success. It's likely they viewed it as a side project to throw out the door before setting DICE back to working on its premier FPS franchise again. Releasing in 2016 to very low fanfare, Mirror's Edge Catalyst took the series in a fairly muted direction, despite keeping its identity. Acting as a prequel to the original, a bit of a head-scratcher considering the City of Glass looks more futuristic here, Catalyst drops the linear approach in favour of offering full player freedom. Making Mirror's Edge Catalyst an open-world title posed a daunting challenge. How do you make a setting where the player can go in any direction in conjunction with Faith's parkour skills? How do you account for the many player choices afforded? It's an ambitious direction for the follow-up to take, but ends up falling short. Before we get to that, however, let's talk about the game's look, this time powered by DICE's Frostbite 3. Just like the first game, the visuals draw you in. Mirror's Edge was already a looker, but Catalyst can look absolutely spectacular. From the moment Faith leaves prison at the start of the game, you'll be left floored at how stunning the game is. From the dazzling neon lights to the massive scale, the art style of the franchise remains fully intact. But while the game's technical presentation impresses, it can't hide the underlying issues. The open world is one of the most stunning ever created for a game, but it's also one of the blandest. Trying to get the balance between gameplay improvements and incorporating them into a new level system was tough, and unfortunately, the latter suffers immensely. People like to rag on Ubisoft games for their samey open-world design, but DICE's first attempt, aside from its gorgeous presentation, leaves much to be desired. The open world isn't as open as the game claims. Instead, you're merely running back and forth between areas multiple times to complete samey objectives. By samey, I mean incredibly cookie-cutter, the same fetch quests that have populated open-world design for years. Collectibles that don't amount to much, simplistic races and item deliveries under a time limit, there's very little imagination here. With parkour and free running being the main focus, there's room to expand the mission design as well. While on occasion there are interiors to run through for shortcuts, most of the time if you try and deviate from the main playing area, Faith is sure to plunge to her death. You do unlock a grappling hook later in the game, but this doesn't go far enough to boost the player's options. To add a sense of dynamic change to the game world, there needed to be hidden paths to uncover. For example, Faith could use her infolink to hack platforms to get across buildings in the latter half of the game, providing an alternative crossing point to all the obvious bridges. The other issue with the open world is that it dilutes the main story. While not great by any means, the plot of Mirror's Edge Catalyst quickly evaporates into the background. It doesn't help that the game world is populated by bland NPCs who stand around giving objectives, hurting the immersion overall. While the game's seamless opening and visuals do hint at pulling the player in, the illusion lacks coherency all around. What players get instead of this is experience points which go towards the game's skill tree system. This also has its ups and downs. On the one hand, it's a bit baffling to have abilities like Quick Turn locked when Faith could do them in the original game, but other elements do fare better. For example, the Focus Shield fixes the issue of Faith being taken down easily while looking for the best escape routes. Despite these additions, however, Catalyst falls into the trap of other skill systems by offering basic improvements that don't add to gameplay whatsoever, like more damage to specific enemy types. This superficiality is a trend many open-world titles need to move away from. The most disappointing thing about Catalyst is that all the gameplay improvements could work brilliantly had they been placed in a game world that fully utilises them. This shows not only in the traversal, but the combat as well. You can tell that DICE really tried to expand and improve on the first game's shortcomings, but old problems ended up resurfacing. I loved how DICE incorporated quick takedowns, allowing Faith to continue running without losing momentum. It's direct engagements where things fall down. Faith can now knock enemies into each other, attack from just about any movement input, and the game cuts to a cinematic angle for final takedowns. The system should work brilliantly, but it's brought down by poor AI and clunky handling. Enemies rarely challenge Faith in combat, instead simply blocking her attacks and dragging out the fights. First-person melee combat is hard to get right. It can end up being fairly basic or cumbersome to the point it slows things down. Holding up your run in the original title wasn't very engaging, and Catalyst is no different, as you'll frequently stop to deplete enemy health bars on your way through the routes. Doing away with guns completely is a step forward, but a hypothetical third entry could go even further and remove direct combat entirely. In the end, DICE's ambitions failed to pay off and the game couldn't make good on its initial promises. Mirror's Edge Catalyst bombed on launch, and while EA never released any official sales figures, the analyst Michael Pachter estimated it moved between 1.7 and 2 million units in total. Knowing EA's ludicrous sales targets, the expectation they had would likely have been at least 5 million. Thus, the Mirror's Edge franchise was sent underground and hasn't been heard from since. The weak sales would have also put the planned TV series on ice as well, which was said to be in development by Endemol Shine North America. Will we ever see the Mirror's Edge franchise again? If EA has anything to say about it, likely not. DICE is now firmly hooked into making Battlefield and Star Wars games year after year with little chance of free reign, with both the original and Catalyst selling far less than their competition. The lesson that can be learned from Mirror's Edge is that great ideas have their potential, but without committing all the way, be it in development or publishing, they end up falling short. You can tap into a unique niche, but their capacity for success is often open to interpretation. Thanks for watching. Despite its flaws, Mirror's Edge still stands out among the countless franchises released. Which of the two was your favourite? Would you want to see a third entry? Let me know in the comments below. You can follow my blog at the links in the description.